In the tense courtroom, Judge Elijah Brooks, a man who had grown up in a poor neighborhood where racism was a daily reality, locked eyes with Raymond Collins, the powerful man who had built his empire on ruthlessness and lies. But the real question lingered in the air. Could justice prevail when Raymond's power threatened to overshadow every crime he'd committed? Subscribe to the channel now and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Raymond Collins stood in front of the large mirror in his office, his eyes burning with an intensity like a flame that could never be extinguished. A cold, confident smile curled on his lips, as if the entire world belonged to him. Every feature of his face, from his straight nose to his sharp, calculating eyes, reflected a deep sense of pride. A pride born from the empire he had built with his own hands, an empire no one could ever break. That feeling of triumph, the moment he stood at the pinnacle of power and success, was one Raymond couldn't help but savor. He wasn't just a dreamer of wealth, he had achieved it all. The sleepless nights, the cunning schemes, everything had led him to become one of the most powerful men in the city. No one could deny his greatness. The losers were merely shadows, insignificant in the glaring light Raymond had forged for himself. He turned and glanced out the window at the bustling street below, where cars raced by and pedestrians hurried along. Raymond knew that, no matter how long they lived, none of them would ever come close to what he had. He had surpassed all the barriers society had set for him, learned to seize every opportunity, and took control of the game. The old, beaten-down folks in the poor neighborhoods, the weak people he once used to build his fortune, now they were nothing more than scraps from the past. "No one can beat me," Raymond whispered to himself, as if affirming the truth. No one. But as his gaze fell on the desk phone, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen, a strange unease stirred within him. A mysterious call. Yet it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Raymond was not one to easily worry, but something about that ringing tone made him feel uneasy. He stood still for a moment, his eyes drifting away from the mirror, as if something in the air had changed. Choosing to ignore the call, Raymond moved toward the window and leaned back against the cool glass, lost in thought. Yet the unease lingered. He could feel something was about to happen, something beyond his control. His rational mind told him nothing could shake his position, but that feeling inside him was beyond explanation. "Don't worry too much," Raymond muttered, trying to calm himself. "Everything's fine." But deep down, a part of him started to doubt. His progress, his victories that once seemed unbreakable, now began to feel like a race against himself. He had achieved everything, yet there was a question that remained unanswered. Was it all truly worth it? The cold smile on his lips never faltered, but in his eyes there was something that couldn't be hidden. A glimmer of doubt, faint yet unmistakable. And then the phone rang again. In a small courthouse tucked away on a quiet street in the city, Judge Elijah Brooks sat high on his chair, the soft light casting a shadow over his face, highlighting the calm and unwavering resolve that defined him. His hair had turned gray, but his eyes still gleamed with sharp insight, honed through years of fighting against prejudice and injustice. His weathered fingers drummed lightly on the table, the rhythmic sound echoing like the steady beat of a heart devoted to justice. Elijah was not one to forget easily. He had grown up in the poorest neighborhoods, where people like him, African American, were treated as second-class citizens. The memories of discrimination, the sneers and glares from when he was a poor child never left his mind. But instead of allowing those memories to crush him, he used them as fuel. He left the place of his birth to chase his dream, becoming a lawyer and eventually a judge. Now, sitting on that judge's seat, he had become a symbol of fairness and hope for the forgotten communities. Each day, Elijah faced complex cases, oppressed individuals and those who took advantage of others' weakness. But what set him apart from other judges was his unwavering commitment to seeking truth and justice. He wouldn't allow power or money to sway his beliefs. Only truth, only justice mattered to him. One morning, as Elijah sat in his office preparing for the day's court session, an unnamed letter appeared on his desk. The letter was cryptic, with no identifying marks except for a postcard containing a brief but ominous message. "We won't let you ignore this. If you continue pursuing this case, it won't just be justice that slips away from you. Your family will pay the price." A chill ran through Elijah, but he wasn't afraid. This wasn't the first time he had faced threats. Years of fighting injustice had taught him how to stand firm against storms, yet this time felt different. These were powerful people, shadows not just lurking in the dark, but able to manipulate the system itself. With a deep breath, Elijah tucked the letter into his drawer and stared out the window at the busy streets. He couldn't let fear control him. He knew that what he was doing wasn't just for himself. It was for those who needed him to stand up for them. The next day, the trial began. A group of lawyers walked in, one of whom Elijah instantly recognized, Raymond Collins. He was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city, a man who had built his empire on shady dealings. Today, Elijah would face him in a lawsuit that could expose the dark secrets Raymond had been hiding for years. As their eyes met, an undeniable tension filled the room. Raymond gazed at Elijah with confidence, as if he were an easy opponent to defeat. But Elijah merely smiled softly, a calm smile that needed no further explanation. He had won bigger battles before, and today he would continue fighting for those who had no voice. This confrontation was only just beginning. Raymond believed that money and power would win the day, but Elijah believed that justice would protect him. "He'll see who the real winner is," Elijah thought to himself, his gaze never leaving Raymond's, prepared to step into the greatest challenge of his career. Raymond Collins was not an easy man to defeat. Just a week after the lawsuit was filed, the first signs of power manipulation began to surface. Witnesses who had initially agreed to testify about Raymond's illegal activities suddenly changed their stories. A few of his lawyers began showing up at local police stations, whispering promises to officers, subtly influencing them. A single glance was enough for Raymond to know that everything was in place for his battle. He lacked neither money nor power, and he was certainly not short of ruthlessness. Judge Elijah Brooks, the one presiding over the case, felt the shadow of danger growing ever closer. The people in his community knew him for his integrity. He wasn't just a judge. He was a defender of the belief in justice, a symbol of hope for the forgotten communities. But to Raymond, he was simply an obstacle to be removed. One morning, as Elijah sat in his office preparing for the trial, a mysterious letter was placed in his hands. It had no sender's name, just a simple postcard. On it was a brief, yet threatening message. "If you continue to pursue this case, not only will justice slip away from you, but your family will pay the price." The dim light from his desk lamp seemed to grow colder. Elijah wasn't frightened. He had received threats before, when he was a young lawyer and even after becoming a judge. But this time, it felt different. Raymond Collins was no ordinary man. He was a powerful figure, wealthy and willing to do anything to protect his empire. But Elijah couldn't back down. He hadn't backed down when he was a child facing discrimination. He hadn't backed down when facing the harsh trials of society. And now he couldn't back down, even if it meant facing down an empire built on crime. That night, Elijah came home with a heavy heart. His wife Clara noticed the worry on his face and said little, only gently taking his hand. They both knew life would never be easy, but Elijah wasn't one to turn back. He didn't even consider giving up. For him, justice wasn't some vague ideal. It was something defended with the blood and tears of countless people in his community. The next day, as the trial began, Raymond walked into the courtroom, cold and arrogant, as if he already knew the outcome. Stepping into the room, he scanned the faces, his eyes locking onto Elijah's. Their gazes met in a long, wordless moment, filled with a silent challenge. Raymond knew that in this fight, Elijah was not just a judge. He was the enemy that had to be defeated, no matter the cost. The trial began amidst a tense atmosphere. The witnesses related to Raymond's money laundering and tax evasion faced immense pressure. Some were threatened while others were coerced into changing their testimony. But Elijah did not give up. He carefully examined each testimony, each piece of evidence, relentlessly searching for the truth, even as the pressure from Raymond's side mounted. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom rose. Clear signs of Raymond's manipulation began to make the prosecutors uneasy. One of Elijah's assistants, who had always been a devoted supporter, entered the room, her face drawn with concern. "Your Honor, I just received a call from the police. They say we need to reconsider some of the evidence. She hesitated, there might be someone who's tampered with everything." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. He knew Raymond wouldn't go down without a fight, but he hadn't expected it to go this far. Raymond wasn't just bribing people within the legal system. He was influencing those directly working on the case. The truth began to unravel. A system being manipulated by money and power, twisting everything into unfairness. Elijah realized that in this battle, he wasn't just up against Raymond, he was fighting an entire system that had become corrupted, where truth and justice couldn't easily prevail. However, Elijah's resolve never wavered. With each encounter with deceit, he grew more determined, not just for himself, but for all those abandoned by this broken system. Raymond Collins had always believed that everything in his life was within his control. Power, money, fame, these were all within his grasp. Every decision was made with cold, calculating logic, and every relationship was measured by its benefit. He had built an empire through sheer ruthlessness and cold-heartedness. But in recent days, a strange, unexplainable feeling had begun to stir within him. It was a conflict, deep and undeniable, a feeling he had never faced before. It all started when he met Daniel Ramirez. Daniel was a 16-year-old Mexican-American boy who lived in a poor neighborhood scarred by Raymond's illegal development projects. Raymond vividly remembered the first time he saw Daniel, on a scorching afternoon, walking with his mother through the land Raymond had purchased to build a luxury condominium. This new high-rise, a part of the empire Raymond was constructing, would push families like Daniel's out of the only home they had ever known. Raymond didn't immediately recall the boy's name, but what he couldn't forget was the look in his eyes. Eyes of a child not filled with hatred or with anger, but with resignation and a deep sadness. On that day, Daniel stood silently, gazing at the fenced-off land, his eyes fixed on where his family's home had once been. A boy, with nothing but an old shirt and worn-out shoes. Yet he held on to something precious that Raymond couldn't understand: hope. After several more chance encounters in the neighborhood, Raymond couldn't help but notice something strange. Every time he saw Daniel, the boy smiled, despite the hardships in his life. He never begged, never displayed bitterness or rage. Even in the direst of circumstances, Daniel had a strong belief that life could be better, that people could change. One day, when Raymond decided to stop by a nearby cafe, he ran into Daniel again. The boy was sitting with a group of friends, and his eyes lit up when he saw Raymond walk in. After a brief hesitation, Daniel stood up and greeted him, his voice soft, his smile ever. "Hello, Mr. Collins," Daniel said, his tone unafraid. "I heard you're building a project here. I hope everything turns out well for all of us." Raymond felt an odd sensation stir within him. A poor child living in a neighborhood ravaged by his projects could say something like that. No anger, no resentment, just acceptance, a hope with no clear reason behind it. "You know who I am?" Raymond asked, surprised. "We know you," Daniel replied, meeting Raymond's gaze with a strange calmness. "My mom and I have lived here for a long time, but I think, if you can make this place better, we'll be grateful to you." Daniel's words struck Raymond like a slap in the face. How could a child, someone directly impacted by the very projects Raymond had carried out, say such things? How could a child hold on to hope in the face of everything he'd lost, when Raymond himself, a man who had everything, felt weary and disillusioned with his life? Raymond couldn't explain the strange feeling in his chest. This boy, despite all the suffering he had endured, still held on to optimism and kindness. And that forced Raymond to confront an uncomfortable question. Had everything he had done, every action he took to build his empire, been truly worth it? That day, Raymond didn't say anything else to Daniel. He left, his mind swirling with thoughts of the boy and his words. It was the first time he felt he had to face an internal conflict. Had he really done the right thing, or had his so-called work been nothing more than manipulation, taking from the weak, like Daniel? As Raymond wrestled with these unspoken questions, Elijah Brooks stood in the midst of a crucial battle of his own. He had organized a public dialogue inviting representatives from various communities, those affected by policies and actions like the projects Raymond had pushed through, to come together, share their stories, and work toward building bridges across societal divides. Elijah believed this would be an opportunity for people to understand each other better, so no one would have to endure discrimination and injustice any longer. The dialogue took place in a large hall with representatives from many different communities, including Black, Latino, and other minority groups. Each person shared their own story, filled with pain but also with hope. They spoke of the hardships they faced, of being excluded, overlooked, and trampled by the system. Raymond, though he didn't want to participate, found himself drawn into the event. He sat quietly in a corner of the room, observing everything. It was the first time he truly saw the depth of the discrimination he had once considered a normal part of life. Every story, every shared experience made him reflect. These people had no choice. They hadn't lived in poor conditions because they hadn't tried, but because they had never been given the chance to change. A woman, tough on the outside but with eyes filled with sorrow, stood up and shared her story. "We live here because we have no other choice. When Mr. Collins came, our neighborhood was torn down to make way for luxury condos. None of us could afford to buy a new home. We were pushed out, like we didn't matter." Raymond listened to her words, a wave of discomfort rising within him. What he had done hadn't just destroyed communities, it had crushed their hopes. The pain they carried, the sacrifices they had made, now reflected back onto his own life. Throughout the dialogue, Elijah kept his eyes on Raymond, his gaze steady and unyielding. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew that only empathy and listening could bring about change. But for Raymond, that change may have already come too late. Raymond Collins stood on the balcony of his office, his eyes gazing out over the city, where the skyscrapers sparkled in the late afternoon sun. To him, it all seemed like a gift. Power, money, the respect he had earned over the years. But as a gentle breeze brushed against his face, a strange feeling of unease swept over him. Everything seemed to be shifting, and he felt as though he could no longer cling to this facade. Alina Carter, the key witness in the case, had made a surprising decision. Despite the threats against her, she would testify in court. This was something Raymond had never anticipated. His heart tightened as he recalled the warnings he had sent her, sharp, vague threats about the consequences if she dared to stand against him. But Alina, despite her age and the heavy burdens she carried, stood firm in her resolve. Her words in private meetings with lawyers, the information she shared about how Raymond had exploited the vulnerability of the poor for profit, all of it made him rethink everything he had done. Each time Raymond encountered Alina, he saw the strength in her eyes, an elderly woman burdened by too many memories of pain and loss, yet never showing fear. His threats seemed powerless against her resilience. This made him stop and wonder, why would she risk everything to go up against him? How could someone he had once seen as weak, incapable of challenging him, make him hesitate? One day, while sitting in his office, an unexpected call came from his sister, Grace Collins. Raymond listened to her voice, choked with emotion, and something in her words made his heart sink. "Raymond," Grace began, "don't you remember? We used to discriminate against our own family because they were different. When Mom was still alive, she would always complain about not being able to accept some of our relatives because they were Asian or because they didn't have enough. We, our own family, at times stood among those who discriminated." Raymond froze, speechless. Grace's words hit him like a shockwave. Back then, he had just seen it as normal, a part of society. But now, looking back, he realized that discrimination didn't only happen in society. It had crept into his very family, even with those he loved the most. Grace continued, her voice breaking as she shared stories Raymond had never paid attention to. "Do you remember? The times we skipped family gatherings because some of Aunt and Uncle's friends were immigrants? We mocked them, talked about how different we were from them. Mom used to say that people from other cultures would never truly fit in with us. Have you forgotten all of this?" Raymond couldn't bear it. Every word she said felt like a flame, burning down the walls he had so carefully built. He felt as though he was being pushed down an irreversible path, where everything he had once believed was now being torn apart. Raisy's words, though bitter, carried a truth he couldn't deny. His entire life he had built his empire on the foundation of discrimination and injustice. But now he was facing the very wounds he had inflicted on his family and others. No longer was there the desire for victory, no longer was there the thirst for power. Raymond felt as though he was drowning in regret. That night Raymond couldn't sleep. In the dark room he was left alone with his thoughts. The guilt clung to him like an unshakable ghost. He thought about Alina, about people like Daniel Ramirez, those whose opportunities he had stripped away. He thought about Grace and the words she had spoken. It was clear to him now, everything he had done could no longer continue as it had. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Raymond made a decision. He couldn't continue down this path. He couldn't live on without changing, without letting the wounds of the past continue to fill the road ahead. It was an awakening he could not avoid. What he had done couldn't be undone, but at the very least, he could start to make amends. The constant battle with insanity could be shielded from him now. He had his life, and Raymond Collins stood before the courtroom doors, his hand clutching the briefcase tightly, but his eyes were fixed on the stairs leading up to the bench. Today was the day that would decide everything. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting in a way he could no longer control. For the past few weeks, his mind had been consumed with two choices: continue down the path he had carved for himself, hiding the truth and protecting his empire, or face the truth, confess the sins he had concealed for so long. As he entered the courtroom, the cold, suffocating air seemed to heighten the tension in his chest. This trial would determine everything. Alina Carter had risen above the threats and pressure to testify against him. Alongside her was the Ramirez family, those who had suffered from the very projects Raymond had pushed, forcing them from the lands they had lived on for generations. The images of them lingered in his mind, like wounds that wouldn't heal. As the trial began, Raymond sat in the defendant's chair, feeling as though the weight of the world was on him. The whispers around him, the glares of anger and hatred from the public, all pointed toward him as a guilty man. This was the moment he could no longer avoid facing himself. Each testimony, every witness, exposed a web of corruption at his center. The threats and manipulations he had used to protect his interests no longer sufficed to hide the truth. Grace Collins sat beside him in the courtroom, her hand gripping his tightly, her eyes filled with concern, but also with hope. She was the one person who had always stood by him, not just during the highs, but through his darkest hours. Grace knew that the decision Raymond was about to make today wasn't just about his own change. It was a chance for their family to heal the deep wounds they had created in the past. Raymond looked at his sister, the one who had always believed in him, and in that moment he felt an overwhelming sense of support. She didn't judge him, didn't express anger or disappointment. Grace simply held his hand gently, her eyes offering him a silent encouragement. "You can do this. It's time to face the truth." Never before had Raymond felt so small. Everything he had built, every advantage he had taken from vulnerable communities, now felt like heavy stones pressing down on him. He wondered if he could bear the consequences of this confession, but then a memory flashed in his mind. The moment he had met Alina Carter, when she had looked at him with understanding, not anger or resentment, but with a strength that made him question. Could he change, or would he remain trapped in the shadow of his wrong choices? The words from Alina's testimony echoed in his mind. What can you do to make amends for your mistakes? She hadn't accused him. She had simply asked, as a reminder of the need for change. As the trial reached its climax, Elijah Brooks, the judge who had remained unwavering in his commitment to justice, his gaze steady and unyielding, looked toward Raymond. Elijah knew this confrontation wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle within the soul of every person involved. Raymond Collins, Elijah's voice rang out, filling the room. Today we are not just here to judge a man. We are here to face the consequences of greed and the injustice created by a system that has benefited the few at the expense of the many. Your actions have caused suffering not just to one person, but to thousands. Today, which side will you stand on? Raymond felt these questions cut deep into his heart like blades. He had once believed he could continue on this path without paying the price, but now he knew he couldn't. He couldn't look away, couldn't continue to hide his wrongs. And then, as the courtroom fell silent, Raymond stood up. A strange quiet enveloped the room as he walked toward the microphone, his eyes meeting Judge Eliza's, then looking at his family, at the witnesses who gazed at him with both hope and sorrow. Your Honor, Raymond began, his voice low but steady. I stand here today to confess all my wrongs. What I have done cannot be justified. I have exploited the vulnerable to build my empire, manipulated the system, and hurt so many people. I apologize to Alina Carter, to the Ramirez family, and to everyone affected by my actions. I'm sorry for the cruelty I have caused. Each word he spoke felt like a storm sweeping through the courtroom. The people in the room listened intently, not daring to breathe. The remorse in his voice signaled a profound change. He continued, his voice softening as he looked toward the Ramirez family, those who had endured so much loss. I know that my apology can never undo the pain I have caused, but I hope this is the first step toward making things right. I cannot change the past, but I want to start, here, now, to do what's right. The silence continued to hold, but it was different now. It wasn't filled with disgust or hatred, but with understanding, with empathy. Alina Carter and the Ramirez family, though silent, their gazes had shifted. No longer was there anger. There was acknowledgement of a man who had made mistakes, but was now seeking a chance to make amends. And, suddenly, Elijah Brooks looked at Raymond, his expression resolute. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement. And then the gavel struck. Raymond Collins, today you have chosen to face the truth. The words you have spoken will not only change your fate, but they will change the lives of those affected by your actions. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future. Raymond stepped down from the stand, feeling as though a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future would hold, but at least today he had taken a bigger step than he ever had before, not in arrogance, but in awakening and truth. Raymond Collins stood in the prison cell, staring through the small window. His eyes, once filled with the pride of his empire, now lacked the gleam they once had. The towering buildings and the glaring city lights outside were now just blurred images. Everything around him was quiet, still, much like the soul inside him. The coldness of this space wasn't due to the walls surrounding him, but because something deep inside him was changing. Raymond had been convicted of crimes he could no longer deny. The network of corruption he had built over the years was now exposed for all to see. The trial had ended with a long sentence, and the outside world had turned its back on him. His old friends, business allies, everyone had abandoned him. They no longer saw Raymond Collins as a man of success, but as a convicted criminal. But in this dark cell, Raymond didn't feel loneliness as punishment. In fact, he saw it as an opportunity, a chance to start over. The days in prison, where there were no lights of power or money, were the days he began to truly face himself. For the first time in years, Raymond had the time to think. He no longer cared about protecting his empire or the relationships that could help him maintain his position. It was just him now, with the mistakes he had made. The long nights in prison were filled with memories. Alina Carter's words, Grace's quiet support, the faces of the people he had hurt. He thought of Daniel Ramirez, the boy he had once pushed out of his neighborhood. Those memories gnawed at him, and he could no longer escape the truth. Raymond began to write, not because he wanted to reclaim his reputation or craft a compelling story to draw attention, but because he needed to confront his mistakes. He wanted to share his journey from a man living in a world of power and cruelty to someone who realized the strength of change and compassion. Every day he sat down to write, reflecting deeply on his life and the lessons learned from the awakening he had never expected. The book Raymond began to write wasn't a simple autobiography. It was a journey of overcoming prejudice, a reminder that people could change if they were willing to look at themselves. He wrote about the wrong decisions he had made, about how he had contributed to the unjust system that Judge Elijah Brooks had spent his life fighting against. He wrote about people like Alina Carter and the Ramirez family, who had suffered because of the projects he had started, and how they hadn't given up hope even when everything seemed to be against them. As the book began to take shape, Raymond realized that he couldn't change the past, but at least he could share his story. He hoped it would be a small flame in the darkness, showing others that they could make a difference. He wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness, but to speak the truth, to face what he had done, and to begin the journey of making things right. Outside, Elijah Brooks continued his career. After Raymond's trial, Elijah had become a national symbol of justice and compassion. People looked up to him not just for his fair rulings, but for his belief that people could change if given the chance. He continued to fight for the oppressed, for the communities society still ignored. He wasn't just a judge, he was a beacon of hope for those who believed in change. One day, as Elijah was preparing for a speech on justice, he received a letter from Raymond. They hadn't seen each other since the trial, and this letter was the first contact Elijah had received from Raymond since he went to prison. In the letter, Raymond shared the book he had been writing, his thoughts and feelings during his time in prison. He sincerely apologized to Elijah, not just for his mistakes, but for not recognizing the importance of the battles Elijah had fought throughout his career. Elijah sat quietly, reading each line of the letter, not feeling anger or resentment. Instead, he sensed a profound change in Raymond, a transformation he hadn't imagined when he saw the man stand before the court. Elijah had known that it might take years to make amends, but he also knew that people could change if they were willing to recognize the truth and confront it. When Raymond's book was published, it caused a stir in the media and became a phenomenon in the community. People began sharing his story, not because of its tragedy, but because of the message it carried. Raymond was no longer just a forgotten man in prison, but an inspiration, a living example that change was possible if someone had the courage to confront their past and build a new future. Elijah, despite being busy with his work, never forgot Raymond. Every time he looked at those fighting for justice and human values, he thought of the man who had once been a symbol of power and greed, but was now becoming a symbol of change. Elijah understood that sometimes justice wasn't just about verdicts or decisions from the bench. It could come from the people themselves, from awakening and patience. And then, one day, when Raymond finished the manuscript of his second book, he received an invitation from Elijah. It was an informal meeting, no witnesses, just the two men sitting and talking about the lives that had changed and the roads that had yet to be traveled. Elijah looked at Raymond with a gentle smile, not a trace of judgment, just understanding. "Raymond, sometimes the path isn't always clear," Elijah said, his voice warm, "but I believe you've chosen the right direction." Raymond smiled quietly, looking out the window where the light streamed in. Though there was still much to be done, he knew that the road ahead would never be easy. But at least he had the change he needed. He was no longer the man of the past. 5 years later, Daniel Ramirez stood in a skyscraper in the heart of the city, where the light streaming through the glass windows reflected the cold concrete and steel. But that light held a different meaning. It wasn't just a reflection of a material world. It was a reflection of his belief in justice, in the opportunities life had offered him. Daniel had become a lawyer. No one could have imagined that the boy from the poor neighborhood, whose family had struggled to survive, would now be standing at the pinnacle of a career he had built with his own strength and determination. It had been a challenging journey, not only because of the academic hardships he faced, but also because of the societal prejudices he had to overcome. But Daniel had never let those things hold him back. In fact, those experiences had made him stronger and more resilient, determined to fight for justice and the rights of the oppressed. One March morning, Daniel received an unexpected call from one of his partners. "You know, Daniel, they want us to take on that case, the Raymond Collins case," the partner said, his voice filled with doubt. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Daniel paused for a moment. The name Raymond Collins, a name he had never forgotten, echoed in his mind. The community had endured so much pain and loss because of Raymond's decisions. Families had been pushed out of their homes, entire communities robbed of their right to live where they had for generations, all for the personal gain of one man. But now, that man had changed. Raymond had confessed his wrongdoings, written a book, and inspired many others. His life was no longer that of a criminal, but a story of regret and transformation. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice firm, "I want to take on this case. But not because of what happened in the past. I'm doing this because I believe in justice, and because I know that everyone can change if they truly want to. People deserve a second chance." It was a difficult decision. Daniel knew that, even though he had chosen the path of a lawyer to fight for the oppressed, taking on Raymond's case was a challenge. He couldn't forget what Raymond had done, but he also understood that without change and forgiveness, no one could walk the path of healing. Raymond, though he had paid for his mistakes, never imagined he would find an opportunity to redeem himself. He had written, faced the truth, and now he was living a life not for himself, but for others. During his time in prison, he had learned many lessons from the inmates he had helped. It wasn't just about teaching basic literacy or job skills. It was about helping them recognize their own worth, helping them rise above the prejudices they faced in society. Looking back on those days, Raymond couldn't help but feel a weight in his heart. In prison, he and a group of inmates had established educational programs where they didn't just learn how to read, they learned about life, about facing their mistakes, and about regret. Raymond couldn't change their pasts, but he could help them build a future. In one discussion with his fellow inmates, he remembered a line from a man who had once been his cellmate, someone who had helped him rediscover a part of his humanity that had been buried. "We are not what society thinks we are what we choose to become." Raymond had chosen the path of change. He couldn't reclaim what he had lost, but at least he could live a different life, a more meaningful one. And when he found himself standing alongside other inmates, he realized that, no matter the mistakes they had made, everyone had the right to start anew, to seek forgiveness, and to live a new life. The day Daniel walked into the law office, he wasn't just a practicing lawyer. He was a symbol of hope for those who had been forgotten. His story wasn't just about becoming a lawyer, it was about making a difference. He didn't just help others defend their rights, he helped them see themselves differently, not as victims of discrimination, but as people who could change and stand up for justice. As Daniel stood at the podium during a public discussion, he saw in the crowd the people who had once been cast aside by society, the ones who had fought for justice their whole lives, the ones who had suffered because of discrimination. But they had something in common. They hadn't given up. And Raymond's story had inspired many, not only within the legal community, but also among the marginalized. The stories of people like Alina Carter, the Ramirez family, and the inmates Raymond had worked with had become living proof that change was possible and that it could happen when people were given the opportunity. When Raymond was released, he didn't return to his old life. He continued his journey, not to regain fame or power, but to create a more just world. He started training programs and teaching those who were once like him, those society had forgotten and looked down upon. He couldn't undo everything, but he could make a small difference, and that was all he needed. Hit the subscribe button and don't forget to leave a comment so I can hear your thoughts and suggestions for future videos.